December 26, 1991. The office was cold despite the radiators clanking along the walls. Moscow's winter had arrived early that year, and the heating system in the Kremlin, like so much else in the Soviet Union, was failing. Mikhail Gorbachev sat behind the massive desk that had once belonged to Lenin, then Stalin, then Khrushchev, then Brezhnev. The desk was too large for him, had always been too large, as if the furniture itself was mocking his inability to fill the roles history had thrust upon him. At 60, Gorbachev looked older than his years. The distinctive birthmark on his forehead seemed more pronounced against his pale skin. His suit, once well-tailored, hung loosely on a frame that had lost weight from stress and exhaustion. In his hand, he held a single sheet of paper, his resignation speech, the words that would officially end the Soviet Union. Across from him sat three men who represented the last fragments of Soviet power. Anatoly Chernev, his chief foreign policy advisor, a man who had believed in perestroika and glasnost and now watched those dreams crumble. Grigory Revenko, his chief of staff, whose job had become increasingly impossible as the structures of government dissolved around them. And Andrei Grachev, his press secretary, who would have to explain the inexplicable to a world that was both celebrating and anxious about what came next. On the television in the corner, a Western model, ironically, CNN was broadcasting live from outside the Kremlin. The reporter, her breath visible in the Moscow cold, was describing this as the end of the Cold War, the final victory of capitalism over communism, the triumph of the American system. In Washington, President George H.W. Bush was preparing to address the nation. In New York, the stock market was celebrating. Around the world, the narrative was being written. America had won. Gorbachev set down the speech and looked at his advisers. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational, as if they were discussing something abstract rather than the dissolution of a superpower. So, they are saying we lost, that America won the Cold War. Chernev, the intellectual, the true believer in reform, responded carefully. Mikhail Sergeyevich, that is the Western narrative, but it is not the only narrative. We did not lose a war. We chose to end a confrontation that was bankrupting both sides. We chose reform over stagnation. We chose openness over secrecy. We chose to destroy ourselves. Gorbachev interrupted, not angrily, but with a kind of weary resignation. That is what they will say. That is what history will record. The Soviet Union collapsed not because America defeated us militarily, but because we defeated ourselves, and perhaps they are right. The room fell silent except for the hissing of the radiators and the distant sound of the CNN broadcast. The reporter was now interviewing American officials, all of them using variations of the same phrase. We won. Senator after senator, analyst after analyst, all agreeing that the Cold War had been a contest, and America had emerged victorious. Revenko, the pragmatist, spoke next. The Americans are declaring victory because it serves their political purposes. President Bush needs this. His approval ratings have fallen since the Gulf War. The American economy is in recession. By claiming victory in the Cold War, he can distract from domestic problems and justify 40 years of military spending. And is he wrong? Gorbachev asked. Did they not win? Look at what has happened. The Berlin Wall fell, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, Eastern Europe has abandoned communism, the Soviet republics have declared independence. In a few hours, the Soviet Union will cease to exist. If this is not defeat, what is? To understand the complex emotions in that room, one must understand the journey that had brought them to this moment. When Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party in March 1985, the Soviet Union was a superpower in decline. The economy was stagnant, weighed down by military spending that consumed perhaps 25% of GDP. The war in Afghanistan was unwinnable and bleeding the country of resources and morale. The Chernobyl disaster in 1986 would expose the incompetence and corruption at the heart of the Soviet system. The country was dying, slowly but inexorably. Gorbachev had recognized this. Unlike his predecessors, the aged conservative men who had led the Soviet Union into sclerosis, Gorbachev believed reform was possible. He introduced perestroika, restructuring, to modernize the economy. He introduced glasnost, openness, to allow free discussion and criticism. He believed the Soviet system could be reformed, could be made more efficient and humane, could compete with the West without the crushing weight of totalitarianism. He had been catastrophically wrong. Glasnost had unleashed forces that could not be controlled. Once people were allowed to speak freely, they spoke about the failures of communism, the crimes of Stalin, the lies of the party. Once the truth was permitted, the entire edifice of Soviet legitimacy crumbled. Perestroika had disrupted the command economy without replacing it with a functioning market system, creating shortages and chaos. The reforms had weakened the center without creating viable alternatives. And then the nationalist movements had begun. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, demanded independence, reminding the world they had been forcibly annexed in 1940. The Caucasus erupted in ethnic conflicts. Armenia and Azerbaijan, Georgia and Abkhazia. Ukraine, the second most populous Soviet republic, began asserting its sovereignty. The empire that Stalin had built through terror and force was coming apart, and Gorbachev lacked the will, or perhaps the moral authority, to hold it together through violence. The Eastern European satellites had gone first. In 1989, Poland held free elections that swept the communists from power. Hungary opened its border with Austria, allowing East Germans to flee west. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, that iconic moment when the Cold War's most visible symbol was torn down by celebrating crowds. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution, Romania's violent uprising, one by one, the communist governments of Eastern Europe collapsed. Gorbachev had let them go. He had refused to send Soviet tanks to crush the uprisings, as his predecessors had done in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. He had told Eastern European leaders they were on their own, that the Brezhnev Doctrine, which claimed the Soviet Union's right to intervene in socialist countries, was dead. It was a moral choice, perhaps even a noble choice, but it was also the choice that ended Soviet power in Europe. The Americans had watched, cautious at first, then increasingly confident. President Ronald Reagan, who had called the Soviet Union an evil empire and challenged Gorbachev to tear down this wall, had been vindicated. His successor, George H.W. Bush, had managed the transition with careful diplomacy, supporting Gorbachev while preparing for what came next. And now, in December 1991, what came next had arrived. Boris Yeltsin, the populist president of the Russian Federation, had outmaneuvered Gorbachev, declaring Russian sovereignty and effectively making the Soviet Union irrelevant. The other republics had followed. On December 8th, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus had met in secret and agreed to dissolve the Soviet Union, creating the Commonwealth of Independent States in its place. Gorbachev had not been consulted. He had been made obsolete. The Soviet Union would officially cease to exist at midnight. The red flag with the hammer and sickle would be lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The country that had survived the Russian Revolution, the Civil War, Stalin's purges, the Nazi invasion, the Cold War, that country would simply disappear, not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic whimper. Gorbachev looked at the television again. President Bush was now on screen, speaking from the Oval Office. His words were measured, diplomatic, but the message was clear. The Cold War is over. Freedom and democracy have triumphed. Freedom and democracy, Gorbachev repeated. as if those were uniquely American concepts, as if we did not also believe in freedom, in our own way, as if the millions who built the Soviet Union, who defeated fascism, who sent the first satellite and the first man into space, as if all of that meant nothing because we could not match American consumer goods. Chernyaev leaned forward. Mikhail Sergeyevich, history will judge us more kindly than the Americans are judging us today. You ended the Cold War peacefully. You could have fought, could have sent tanks into the Baltic states, could have used force to hold the Union together, but you chose peace over bloodshed. That is not defeat. That is moral courage. Moral courage, Gorbachev said bitterly. A fine epitaph for a failed leader. He had moral courage while his country disintegrated around him. Gorbachev, the press secretary, spoke for the first time. We need to address this narrative. The Americans are claiming total victory, as if the Cold War was a football match and they scored more goals. But that is not what happened. The Cold War ended because both sides chose to end it. The arms race was bankrupting everyone. The risk of nuclear war was unacceptable. We made agreements, INF Treaty, START, that reduced the danger. This was not American victory. This was mutual recognition that the confrontation had to end. Try telling that to CNN, Ravenko muttered, gesturing at the television where analysts were already discussing the peace dividend, the money America could now save by reducing military spending, now that the Soviet threat was gone. Gorbachev stood and walked to the window. Outside Red Square was nearly empty, just a few tourists and Muscovites hurrying through the cold. Tomorrow this would all belong to Russia, not the Soviet Union. The Kremlin would still be the seat of power, but it would be Russian power, not Soviet power. The distinction seemed both enormous and meaningless. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Gorbachev said, his back to the room. "It is not that we lost. It is that we lost to ourselves. The Americans did not defeat us. Reagan's military buildup did not defeat us. Star Wars, that fantasy missile defense system, did not defeat us. We defeated ourselves through our own contradictions, our own inefficiencies, our own lies." He turned back to face his advisors. The Soviet system was built on a lie, that communism could create a workers' paradise, that central planning was superior to markets, that the party knew better than the people. For 70 years, we maintained that lie through force and propaganda. And when I tried to reform the system, when I tried to introduce truth and transparency, the lie collapsed. Because there was nothing underneath. No foundation, just fear and force. And when those were removed, everything fell apart. Chernyaev stood, his voice passionate. "But Mikhail Sergeyevich, that is exactly why history will remember you favorably. You had the courage to admit the truth. You had the courage to try to reform a system that could not be reformed. And when the system collapsed, you had the courage to let it die rather than preserve it through violence. Stalin would have killed millions to preserve the Soviet Union. Brezhnev would have sent tanks. But you chose differently." "And what has that choice brought?" Gorbachev asked. "Chaos, economic collapse, ethnic conflicts, in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Nagorno-Karabakh. Violence is spreading because the Soviet structure that held these regions together is gone. Yes, I chose not to use force, but what kind of choice is that, to choose between tyranny and chaos?" The television showed footage from earlier in the day, long lines outside Moscow stores, people trying to buy bread and milk with rubles that were losing value by the hour. The economic situation was catastrophic. Hyperinflation was beginning. The social safety net that had defined Soviet life, guaranteed employment, free healthcare, subsidized housing, was disintegrating. People were terrified, and they blamed Gorbachev. "The Americans are celebrating," Ravenko said, "but they do not understand what is coming. They think the end of the Soviet Union means the end of problems, but we have 30,000 nuclear weapons scattered across 4 new countries. We have a military that has not been paid in months. We have nationalist movements that could lead to civil wars. The Americans should not be celebrating. They should be terrified, of what happens next. It was a prescient observation. In the years to come, the world would indeed grapple with the consequences of Soviet collapse. The rise of oligarchs who looted state assets, the wars in Chechnya and Georgia, the nuclear security concerns, the rise of Vladimir Putin, and the reassertion of Russian nationalism. But in December 1991, the Americans saw only victory, only the vindication of their system, only the end of a threat that had defined their foreign policy for 45 years. Gorbachev returned to his desk and picked up his resignation speech. He had written it himself, with help from Chernev. It was dignified, reflective, acknowledging both achievements and failures. He would deliver it at 7 p.m. Moscow time in a televised address that would be his last act as President of the Soviet Union. "What should I say about the American claims of victory?" he asked. "Should I challenge them? Should I argue that this was not a defeat, but a transformation?" Chernev considered the question. "You should tell the truth, as you have always tried to do. The Cold War ended not because one side won, but because both sides recognized it had to end. The confrontation was unsustainable. The arms race was madness. The division of Europe was unjust. We made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but we also made progress. We ended the threat of nuclear war. We freed Eastern Europe. We allowed the Soviet people to speak freely for the first time in 70 years. And in the process, we destroyed the Soviet Union," Gorbachev finished. "Yes," Chernev agreed, "but perhaps the Soviet Union needed to be destroyed. Perhaps it was a historical dead end, a system that could not adapt, could not survive in the modern world. If that is true, then what you did was not defeat. It was liberation. Liberation from a system that had become a prison for all of us." Gorbachev nodded slowly. It was a way of understanding what had happened, a narrative that was more complex than simple victory and defeat. But he knew that narrative would not prevail, at least not immediately. The Americans would write the history of the Cold War, and they would write it as a story of their triumph. On the television, the CNN reporter was now interviewing ordinary Americans, asking them what the end of the Soviet Union meant to them. A middle-aged man in a baseball cap said, "It means we won. America is number one." A young woman said, "It means my children won't grow up afraid of nuclear war." An elderly veteran said, "It means all those boys who died in Korea and Vietnam, their sacrifice meant something. We stopped communism." Simple narratives. Clean narratives. Victory and defeat. Good and evil. The American system versus the Soviet system, and the American system had won. But in that cold office in the Kremlin, the reality was more complicated. Gorbachev had not surrendered to American military might. He had tried to reform a system that could not be reformed, and in the process, he had inadvertently destroyed it. The Soviet Union had not been defeated in battle. It had collapsed from within, from its own contradictions and failures. Was that defeat, or was it something else? Recognition of reality, acceptance of failure, the courage to let go of a system that no longer worked. "I will not concede defeat," Gorbachev said finally. "I will not give the Americans the satisfaction of claiming total victory, but I will acknowledge the truth that the Soviet system failed, that our experiment with communism did not produce the results we promised, that we could not compete with the West economically or technologically. I will acknowledge that we lost the Cold War, not because America defeated us, but because we could not sustain our own system." It was a subtle distinction, but an important one. The Soviet Union had not been conquered, it had imploded. The Americans had won by default, by simply outlasting a system that was collapsing under its own weight. At 7 p.m. Moscow time, Mikhail Gorbachev delivered his resignation speech. Sitting at that massive desk, looking into the camera with tired eyes, he spoke for 15 minutes. He acknowledged the achievements of perestroika, the end of the Cold War, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the democratization of Soviet society. He acknowledged the failures, the economic crisis, the rise of nationalism, the collapse of the Union. And he said this: "We live in a new world. The Cold War has ended, the arms race has stopped, and the threat of world war has been removed. We have opened up to the world, and we have rejected totalitarianism. But the transition to a new system has been difficult and painful. We have made mistakes. I have made mistakes. But I believe history will judge that we chose the right path. The path of freedom over tyranny, the path of peace over confrontation." He did not say, "We lost." He did not concede American victory. But he acknowledged the reality that the Soviet Union was finished, that the communist experiment had failed, that a new era was beginning. When he finished, he signed a decree transferring control of Soviet nuclear weapons to Boris Yeltsin. At 7:32 p.m., the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin dome for the last time. The Russian tricolor was raised in its place. The Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. In Washington, President Bush addressed the nation shortly afterward. His speech was triumphant, but carefully diplomatic. "The Cold War is over," he said. "The Soviet Union has collapsed not because of military defeat, but because the communist system could not deliver on its promises. This is a victory for democracy, for freedom, for the American way of life. We won." The phrase echoed through American media for days, weeks, years. We won. It became the accepted narrative, the story that Americans told themselves about the Cold War. They had stood firm against communist aggression. They had built up their military. They had supported freedom fighters around the world, and in the end, their system had proven superior. It was not entirely wrong. The American system, with all its flaws, had proven more adaptable, more innovative, more capable of delivering prosperity than the Soviet system. American military power had forced the Soviets into an arms race they could not afford. American support for dissidents and reform movements had helped undermine communist regimes in Eastern Europe. But it was not entirely right either. The Soviet Union had not been defeated in battle. It had not been conquered. It had collapsed from within, from its own failures and contradictions. Gorbachev's reforms had accelerated the collapse, but the rot had been there long before he came to power. In the years that followed, the debate continued. American conservatives pointed to Reagan's military buildup and his ideological confrontation with communism as the key factors in Soviet collapse. American liberals argued that Gorbachev deserved credit for choosing reform and peace over confrontation. Russian nationalists blamed Gorbachev for destroying a superpower that could have been reformed more gradually. Russian reformers praised him for ending tyranny and opening Russia to the world. Gorbachev himself spent the rest of his life defending his legacy, arguing that he had ended the Cold War peacefully, that he had chosen freedom over force, that he had prevented bloodshed on a massive scale. He rejected the narrative of American victory, insisting that the Cold War had ended through mutual agreement, not unilateral defeat. But the American narrative prevailed. In movies and books, in political speeches and history textbooks, the story was told as a story of American victory. The Cold War had been a contest between two systems, and the American system had won. The Soviet Union was relegated to history's ash heap, a failed experiment, a cautionary tale about the dangers of communism. What the Kremlin said when the US declared the Cold War won was complex, nuanced, and ultimately drowned out by the louder, simpler American narrative. Gorbachev refused to concede defeat, insisted on a more complicated story, argued for recognition of moral courage and peaceful transformation, but his voice was one among many, and the victors write the history. The truth, as always, was more complex than either narrative allowed. The Cold War ended not because one side won decisively, but because one side collapsed internally while the other endured. The Soviet system failed not because it was militarily defeated, but because it could not adapt to the modern world, could not match Western economic dynamism, could not maintain legitimacy once its citizens were allowed to speak freely. America won the Cold War the way a marathon runner wins when their opponent collapses from exhaustion, not through superior speed in any given moment, but through superior endurance over the long haul. It was a victory, but not the kind of victory that military parades celebrate. It was the victory of a system that, for all its flaws, proved more resilient, more adaptable, more sustainable than its rival. And in that cold office in the Kremlin, on December 26, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev understood this. He understood that he was presiding over the end of an empire, the failure of an ideology, the collapse of a system that had promised paradise and delivered oppression. He understood that history would remember this as defeat, no matter how he tried to frame it. But he also understood that he had made choices, difficult, painful choices, that had prevented even greater catastrophe. He had chosen peace over war, freedom over tyranny, truth over lies. And perhaps, in the end, that was enough. Not victory, but something more important, the courage to face reality and accept its consequences. The Soviet Union died not with the roar of battle, but with the quiet click of a television camera, broadcasting to the world the final admission that the communist dream had failed. And America, watching from across the ocean, declared victory and moved on to face new challenges, new enemies, new chapters in the endless story of power and competition. The Cold War was over. And whether it ended in victory or collapse, in triumph or tragedy, depended entirely on where you stood and what story you needed to tell yourself to make sense of it all.